G'day Brewers. In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly everything you need to know to get started as a Gypsy brewer, what the difference is between Gypsy brewing and contract brewing, and how to calculate your costs as a Gypsy brewer. Ready? Let's get brewing. My name is Hendo, and I'm from Rockstar Brewer. I give brewers the tools they need to make awesome beer. If you want to know more about that, hit me up on the website. And if you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing. Each week I answer questions from professional brewers just like you. If you've got a question that you want to ask me, feel free to leave a comment below. This week's question comes from Mo Sunny, and he writes, "G'day Hendo, thanks heaps for the very informative vids. I brew in a tiny brewery setup on a commercial level. As a growing business, we're facing serious upgrade requirements, but I'm considering approaching other local breweries to discuss Gypsy brewing. I don't really want to consider contract brewing because as the brewer, this pretty much takes me out of the picture. Any advice on these options, and especially hidden costs of Gypsy brewing? Cheers." Have you thought about becoming a Gypsy brewer? I'm sure you have, that's why you're here. If you've thought about becoming a Gypsy brewer, leave a comment "yes" below. Now, Gypsy brewing is something I can certainly help you out with because, after all, I used to be a Gypsy brewer. I wasn't too bad at it either. Won a few trophies, a few medals. I had a lot of fun and I got to work with some of Australia's and indeed some of the world's best brewers. I also used to be a head brewer of a contract brewery, so I kind of understand both sides of the equation here. So let's drill down into it. Gypsy brewing is a very common way for new brewers to enter the craft beer market. I mean, you've got some amazing beer recipes, why not go and take them to the world? And why not make a business out of it? Gypsy brewing's pretty cool in that it lowers the barriers of entry into the beer market because you don't have to fork out hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in expensive brewing equipment. Gypsy brewing is also really common with established breweries who are nearing the upper limits of their production capacity. I mean, if you've got the ability to sell more beer, surely you'd want to be able to make more beer, so you might go and talk to other breweries about making your beer recipes for you. And that gives you more beer to sell. There's always been a pretty stark distinction between Gypsy brewing and contract brewing. With Gypsy brewing, Gypsy brewers tend to get pretty involved in the production of their beer. They want to take really close ownership of it and have really tight control over the production of the beer to make sure it's made in the way that they want. With contract brewing, on the other hand, it's more of a, hey, pick up the phone, hey, can I have X number of cases of this lager, put down the phone, and a few weeks later they come out of the contract brewery, and you send a truck and you pick them up. I've nothing against contract brewing. I mean, it serves a different market, really. But whether you Gypsy brew or you contract brew, I'm going to give you 5 tips that you need to know in order to be a successful Gypsy brewer. Here goes. Tip number 1, understand your production costs. It's probably one of the most important things as a Gypsy brewer you need to understand, because as a Gypsy brewer, you don't have a brewery or a tap room, so there's no way you can actually sell your beer direct to the retail market, so your margins are significantly less. Costs are usually broken down into 4 components. Number 1, raw materials, so that's malt, hops, yeast, etc., all the things that go into making the liquid that is beer. Secondly, packaging. So maybe you might be putting your beer into bottles or cans or kegs, and if you are, then you've got the cost of, say, cans, can lids, can labels, you might have pack techs or some sort of cluster, then you've got a carton outer, or sometimes it's called a shipper, and then you've got to stick it on a pallet and get it out the door. All of that forms part of your packaging costs. Excise, or just general federal government taxes. You might not like them, but they're just a cost of doing business and you pass it on to your consumers anyways. And lastly, the co-pack fee. What's a co-pack fee? Well, a co-pack fee is a fee that your host brewery will charge in order to provide you with the services around making your beer. So that might be the brewer's labour, it'll be the rent for the brewery, it'll be the electricity and gas and all the other utilities, and everything else that goes into the making of the beer. Now, the most important thing about the co-pack fee is that this actually also contains your host brewery's profit margin. In my experience, everything that goes into making Gypsy brewed beer is charged on at cost with the exception of the co-pack fee. Maybe they might charge a small administration fee to cover the secretary punching in the invoice or something like that, but generally all the things like raw materials and packaging and stuff like that are charged at cost. The other thing you need to agree with your host brewery in advance is who's bringing what to the table. Are you providing the raw materials? Are you providing the packaging? What do you need to sort out before you start making beer? When you add all of those things together, what you wind up with is what's called an ex-works cost. And that is the unit cost of a keg or a case of beer at the brewery ready for you to pick up and take away. After you've got your ex-works cost, there are other costs involved downstream in selling beer, things like transportation and your sales force and that sort of thing. But that's outside of the scope of this video. I'll just take it up to the ex-works cost. If you make sure that you've got a grasp on all of your costs, you can make sure that your sell price is right and you've got a sustainable business. Tip number 2, get involved in the production and the quality management of your beer. By Gypsy Brewing and using a host brewery, you're entrusting your very, very precious beer and your recipes to a third party. And as a Gypsy brewer, you want to make sure that you're very deeply involved in the making of the beer. But this is a two-way relationship that you've got with your host brewery. After all, it's their brewery, but it's your beer. So make sure that when you're dealing with the head brewer of your host brewery, that you have a conversation in advance about what your expectations are around your beer and the best way that you want your beer to be made. The head brewer is going to come back to you with his kind of pots and pans differences is kind of what I call it. And it's important that you make sure that you establish everything up front before you get to brew day. I remember when I used to be a head brewer of a contract brewery, we used to have Gypsy brewers come in, and it was really cool because I would basically leave them to go and run the brew day, and I'd go and kick back in the office and put my feet up. When you're dealing with a host brewery, your host brewery's head brewer has got a lot of other things that you need to be mindful of and respectful of. Things like the safety of his staff, the actual capabilities around, say, things like grain load in the mash tun, and all that sort of thing. So be respectful of your host brewery's head brewer. Most head brewers that I've come across over the years are passionate, just as you are, about making your beer well. But they've just got their operational issues to deal with as well. Most importantly, it's supposed to be a collaborative relationship. So find that common ground, have an open and frank conversation, and make sure that you execute well. It'll lead to better beer. Tip number 3, focus on selling your beer. As a Gypsy brewer, you might not own a brewery and all of the stainless steel and all of the operational headaches that go with it, and that doesn't mean your job's particularly easier. Your job now is to get out there and sell your beer. Because you might be a Gypsy brewer, but you're definitely a brewing company owner, and you've got to think about it like a business. So that means looking at things like your branding, your artwork, your marketing strategy, your sales strategy. All those sorts of things need to come together in order for you to sell your beer. You could have the most amazing beer recipe ever, but if you're not focused on the sales, then it's all going to be for naught. So focus your efforts on creating an amazing, captivating, and engaging brand that your consumers will want to buy again and again. Tip number 4, get involved in the financials. Just because you haven't had to outlay money on building a brewery doesn't mean that you don't have to think about the financials. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Because you're using a host brewery's equipment, that means you're paying their wages and they're making a margin. So your cost of production is actually higher. As a Gypsy brewer, you will never ever be price competitive like someone who owns their own brewery. And that's particularly true in Australia. We've got a $100,000 a year refund from the ATO for those with excise manufacture licenses. And as a Gypsy brewer, that's $100,000 per year that you're never going to get. So if you're not as price competitive and cost competitive as a brewing company that actually owns their own stainless steel, how do you make your business financially viable? It works one of two ways. You can either sell a very small volume of beer at a high price or a very large volume of beer at a lower price. What exactly does that mean though? Well, if you're a Gypsy brewer who's making lager, pale ale, IPA, and lots of what you would consider mainstream beers, you're going to find it hard to compete on price because you've got the disadvantage of not having the excise refund, and you also have the disadvantage of paying for someone else's profit margin. And to be quite honest, I'm yet to see a Gypsy brewing company that makes mainstream styles of beer and has really gone on to be successful. But if you know one, let us know in the comments below. But in your case, Mo, where you're running out of production capacity and you need some overflow production, you could actually do well out of this, because I would probably say that you've probably got a tap room, and let's say you outsource some of your packaged product. You could sell those cans of beer at your tap room at retail margin, and that's totally viable. So let's say you're a Gypsy brewer. How exactly do you create a sustainable Gypsy brewing business? Well, you need to get innovative. And when I say get innovative, I'm talking about brands like Omnipolo, Mikkeller, and here in Australia, we've got a brand called Co-Conspirators. I really like the creative beers that they do. All three of those companies make some amazing, very creative beers that you may not buy a six-pack of, but they're certainly of high value that you'll pay a higher price to buy a single. And there's a big enough market out there of beer geeks who are really thirsty for high value, and that means high margin, low volume beers. So if you're thinking about starting a Gypsy brewing company in that way, by all means, it's certainly something to think about. And the fifth and last tip is, have fun. If you're going to go down the path of becoming a Gypsy brewer, it's really important that you express your passion about your beers through your brand and through to your consumers. But again, I don't think really there's a place for a Gypsy brewer to brew mainstream beers like Pale Ale, Lager and IPA. If you create a sustainable business, it's going to make having fun so much more fun. So thanks for your question, Mo. I really appreciate it. If you're a professional brewer and you've got a question that you want to ask me, feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks heaps for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.